we have a presentation from Crystal Hishorn, who is the VP of Engineering at Zoa. Now, this is Tech Leaders Playbook, Galvanizing Product and Tech Organizations to Deliver Repeated Success. So I will welcome to the stage Crystal. Crystal, come on up. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Everybody good?
Yeah.
People getting hungry? About an hour for lunch. Cool, thank you for coming. It's amazing to see you all. I know quite a few people in the audience, so no pressure. Cool, thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk about my own experiences of doing tech leadership roles pretty much for the last 10 years, but I've been doing tech roles for over 2 decades now. So I started off as a software engineer, like a lot of you, worked my way up to being a principal engineer, and then moved into leadership roles. I guess today what I want to share is like when we go into tech leadership roles, there isn't a lot out there in terms of like preparing us for what it's going to be like to be in these roles. It's very uncharted territory. And so I want to I'll teach you some of the things that I've learned along my path. So I kind of think back to like when I was 9 is when I learned how to code. It's like a long route from playing around with like CGI scripts and Perl, FTP, early sort of CSS, JavaScript, and I just would have never imagined that I could make a career out of this and that I would get to where I am today. So today I'm actually it said VP, but I'm actually a CTO at a company called Zoa. We work in climate, green tech, more energy tech. If you remember Bulb Energy, that went through administration and we spun out of the back of that. So if you want to geek out about energy and climate tech afterwards, very happy to talk about that because it's a cool space to work in. So I'm going to kind of cover this as kind of a 30, 60, 90, but it's probably more like your first 3 to 6 months in a new role, or you could be like doing a reorg. It doesn't have to be that you're going fresh into an organization. Although I'd say you probably have the most amount of leverage when you first do join a company. So this is our person, our tech person. So I think somebody mentioned yesterday, like when you go into these leadership roles, particularly VP+, you kind of are stepping into this more kind of executive role. And I think somebody summarized it really well yesterday. It's like you're not there necessarily to advocate for the tech org. You're bringing the business to the tech org and trying to impart that kind of business knowledge and the kind of business aspirations and goals, constraints, competitors, all of these things back to the tech org, and trying to ground that into your own technical expertise and bring that forward into a strategy and a vision and a mission that they can understand as well. But it's also about partnering with your executive team. So I think it's actually a little bit bi-directional because you do need to do some amount of advocacy to your exec team too. But it's about working and partnering well with your exec team. And so you might have things like chief product officers, chief revenue officers, chief operations officers. And I think a big part of this role is like about getting curious about those other functional areas. I had an exec coach sort of 5, 6 years ago, and I just remember at the time, like this was my first time stepping into a VP role. And this was back when I was at Condé Nast, which is like a global magazine publisher. And I started off there leading a team of 2 people. And then growing that really rapidly to about 100 people in London, and then taking on a responsibility around 13 global geographies. So I had lots of CTOs reporting into me from different geographies. And that was quite a weird thing to happen over 3 or 4 years, because I think like as technologists, we feel like, hold on, what's happening here? I'm losing part of my identity. Now I feel like I'm becoming a generalist rather than kind of leveraging my deep kind of expertise as a technologist. And she said something interesting to me. She said, but that's kind of your role now. You do need to become more kind of curious and generalist as you go up the leadership path, but you have to not let go of the fact that you do have this experience to bring to bear to the leadership team. And so like, let's think about the first kind of 30 days. Maybe, like I said, maybe it's a major reorg that you've gone through. Oh, and by the way, this isn't a block of cheese. Just making people think about food again. This is a sponge. So I'd say, like, you maybe can't tell because there's a lot of transparency there. But I think like when you go in, like whether it be new role, new reorg, it's about like being curious. I think it's also like bringing enthusiasm, but also kindness as well. Because I think what tends to happen is we go into say a new role, new company, and we can easily pathologize things that happened in the past. And we might have a lot of judgment, but I'd say like leave the judgment at the door and just be really curious. But the thing that I've also seen work well is just be really enthusiastic, even if you're thinking, oh my God, what have they done? But maybe just keep that in your head and bring that out a little bit later, but in a kind way. But I have to say that the first bit is really about absorbing as much as you can, as fast as you can. And so what kind of things? Is there an existing vision, mission, strategy and objectives? A lot of times, this isn't really written down, or it's not in the state that you would hope for. So this could be even like getting just time with the chief executive, peers, people that you're managing, but just any kind of existing documentation, even if it's out of date around this, is something that you should get your hands on straight away. And maybe even learn a bit about this during the interview process. Business maturity is quite important as well. So one of the things that I see happen a lot, like as an anti-pattern, I would say, is that people tend to assume that we need to do something, but from experience, you're like, but it's not the right time. Like it's too early or it's too late. And kind of a clear example that I am dealing with kind of and have dealt with before is like, say, wanting to put in like platforms or make technical changes which you think are way too early. Because you think, well, yes, sure, but like today we are a startup and we need to scale to that point. Maybe that's a decision we make in 1 to 2 years' time, but that's not something we need to do today. And I think that's something I've seen happen quite a lot in my roles. But I think like given the kind of broad experience that you can bring to bear, you can kind of help your people understand and coach them in terms of where to be. Market fit and differentiators. So it might depend on where you are. So if you're an early stage startup, market fit is really important. And I'll come to a bit in a minute around how to do market fit, but also not being too afraid of pivoting as well. But you need to know what your core differentiators are. So again, talking about my current company as well, I went in because it was Bulb, and I thought, people loved Bulb. Had a great consumer experience. But the more I was there, after kind of 2 or 3 months, I thought, you know what, actually what makes this really, really powerful is the machine learning that the team has been building for the last 6 years. And being able to do things like optimization across different devices and kind of electrify the home is what we're trying to do as well. And it's like, that's actually the power. That's where they've written actual white papers and implemented this in practice. And so that's kind of the things that you have to think about, like, what can our competitors not do, and focus really heavily on that space. Customer needs. I think this is something I see a lot of people do too, is they don't go out and have customer calls. They don't go to customer calls. They don't speak to customers. They might have a UX team, and the UX team provides the research. But I'd say like going back to kind of agile and lean, kind of in the early days when it actually meant something, which is not what it's been kind of turned into now. But like I'd say like get out there in front of your customers if you can. Like either you can take on a solutions engineering hat and actually have to deal with real world problems, or even just from an observation standpoint. But I'd say get in touch with your solutions engineering teams, your customer success teams, your sales teams, and just get on those calls as soon as possible. Competitors, I think this is a key thing too. Understand what your competitors do. What is it that they do better than you, and what is it that you do better than them? Because I think another kind of tendency is to do things way too broad and trying to boil the ocean and do everything at once. Again, I'll talk about this in a minute, but that's something we did at my current company as well. We had a broad strategy which we pivoted from after doing a lot of competitor analysis. Constraints. So budgets is a big one. Like I think it's funny. Like when I went into leadership roles, I didn't realize how much time I would spend in spreadsheets and budgets and like headcount and like to have enough money, like spending time with vendors, negotiating costs, optimizing for costs, looking at cloud spend. But this is a big deal for tech. Like we tend to own probably the largest budget in the business, usually. And so that can be millions of pounds, easily, or even hundreds of millions, depending on where you work. But so that's one skill set you got to get used to. The capability, I think it's like, what is your team capable of now, and trying to assess that as quickly as you can. I think also like identifying who are your best partners, both from like your right hand to people that you can also kind of delegate to fairly swiftly as well. But where are your gaps as well? Like, where do you feel like we don't have enough strength in certain areas, and where might we need to either coach people up or even hire for new roles? Because I think that's one of the things that you should look at really quickly when you come in. And governance and policies, like, are they helping you or are they hindering you? When I think about governance as well, when I think about my time, because I was at a developer security company called Sneak before my current company, and when I first went in, one of the things that caused a lot of probably waste and confusion was that I was heading up their infrastructure area, which was brand new, and IT and security also thought they had a say about everything that I was doing. And so it was like, okay, well, we could keep fighting, or we could sit down and create like a governance model that makes sense. And so we ended up with this framework that was like, okay, look, somebody needs to set the policy, somebody needs to figure out how we're going to build it, and then somebody needs to figure out how we're going to run it as well. And that was a nice little framework that we used to kind of sit down and say, okay, who's responsible for what at what stage of the development life cycle? And I'd say, like, these are things that can cause a lot of waste inside organizations if you don't put in the active effort to try and overcome that. And policies can be the same. They can be really restrictive, and you have to know when it serves you and when it doesn't, and be willing to push back and change. Again, just gather up as many architecture diagrams, decision records, roadmaps, risk registers, postmortems that you can on the way in. These are a great kind of source of information and context to get you up to speed. Ways of working. How do teams work? It could be that they're using sprints, Kanban, couldn't be any of these things. Could be that there are certain parts of the org that are having friction with other parts of the org, and just looking at, again, I think a key thing is just looking at waste, like what is inefficient, and trying to overcome that. So this is a drag and waste. And then culture, like it always looks quite good on the way in. I mean, you decided to work there. But often when we get on the inside, we see things that we like and we don't like. And it could be, frankly, sometimes a bit ugly as well. And it's like, what is that we might want to change? And then the capability of your current staff. And I left one of my favorites for last, which is process and ownership gaps. I think ownership. This is one I think I've seen in every single company I've been in, which usually fails, at least when or there isn't a clear ownership model when I join a company, usually. And sometimes I'm like, I don't really understand why. I don't know if it's like that people aren't willing to put in the work to do it, but I have to say, like, it is worth the effort, because this will create so much waste if you don't do it. And it's kind of the not it game as well. Like when you get past about 5 engineers, this is the game that we play. It's like there's lots of teams, I'm not it. It's not me, it's not it. The way that I tend to think about this as well is like, the best framing I can say is like, who's going to be on call for this? When we put somebody on call, who's going to get called to mitigate this? And that helps you frame, okay, yeah, actually, you know what, it makes sense probably for this to live here. But I think going through things like event storming, domain-driven design, and making sure everything is kind of has assigned owners through GitHub, and any kind of service catalog, and making sure that's maintained and up to date is really worth the effort. Okay, so that was a lot. So one of the first things you should do, I think, I'm going to talk about this a lot, is like you need to kind of cast the organization forward. I'm going to talk briefly about this one, and I'm not going to go onto it too much because I suspect this has been covered quite a lot in this conference. But one of the examples I wanted to use was during my time at Sneak, when I first joined, we just got a new SVP of engineering, and he came from he was the CTO at a very large ticketing events organization. And one of the first things he did was give us all a copy of the S1 that they used when they filed for IPO. And I thought that was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It was like, and I said, oh, was this written at the time that you, and he said, no, we did this like 18 months early to 2 years early. And he said, because I wanted my organization to already be thinking about what's going to happen at the end. What is the platform that we're building for the future? I think this is really, really key, and something that I see a lot of technical leaders avoid, is you need to set out your vision and your mission pretty early on. Even if it changes a little bit, that's fine. But you need to get everybody kind of casting their mind forward into the future and getting really excited about that future as well, but in a way that they can kind of tangibly grasp it. So things like that, like if you have artifacts like that, I say like share them broadly, share them widely, and get people to kind of think about like, well, what would it be? What is our future? Like if we're successful in 2 to 5 years' time, what is it? What will we have built? So I know that this book has probably also been coming up a lot in the conference. I love this book. I've read this probably cover to cover twice, and have even gone through with a pen, highlighting lots of passages. It's more than I could cover, but I have to say, like, it's a great book. I think he puts a quote in there somewhere around the fact that why is there so much bad strategy? And a lot of times it's because we fall into what he calls the hallmarks of bad strategy, which are like writing things that are fluffy, writing things that fail to face the challenge, mistaking goals for strategy, and then writing bad strategic objectives that don't address the critical issues, or they're impractical to implement. And he says, like, a lot of times what companies will do is they'll focus on tactics because that feels immediate, tangible, and they will not go through the hard work of actually creating a vision and a strategy. But again, read this book. If I'd say one book, this is a great book. And again, I adopt a lot of my practice and principles from Amazon. So working backwards, there's a book on this, but this is where it came from. Again, like thinking about your North Star, where are you going to go, and how are we going to get there? But I think start with the end and work back. We talked about customers earlier as well, like the needs to talk to them. I have to say, one thing you need to be aware of as well is that usually running a tech org, you have multiple masters to serve. So like you probably have external customers, but you also have internal customers as well. And so like one thing I say is just don't forget about them. I ran a developer experience team at my last company as well, and their main audience was internal. And I say like the same kind of principles apply. It doesn't really matter if it's internal or external. But it's about like how do you make design decisions and focus on their needs, their pain points. And again, I think a lot of this is just coming back to like the early days of probably a lot of our careers where we probably did some amount of user experience because the roles weren't so differentiated back then. But also, what did Agile and Lean actually tell us, and XP as well? So kind of a quick moment on market fit. So what it talks about here is like in your kind of first piece, you're doing your mission, your vision, your strategy, and then you go through this validation loop, going out and talking to customers, doing the research, looking at what your competitors are doing, and kind of to give an example of something that I went through quite recently, in fact, in my current company, is we did pivot our strategy. So this was an actual startup, probably the earliest I've been in a startup, to be fair. And we had this very broad platform from Bulb, and it did lots of things. But the more we went out to events, the more we spoke to customers, the more we talked to prospects, the more we did our market research on like how much are people adopting EVs and heat pumps and solar panels versus what do large energy suppliers need around, automating supplier tooling and kind of communications. It was clear to us that we had too broad a strategy. So basically we pivoted to saying, look, let's just go all in on electrification. Let's talk about how do we electrify the home, because this seems to be the thing that's landing with customers, and it seems to be the thing that we're selling. And that was, for me, it was a great thing to do because it's a very scary kind of thing to do when you think, well, this means completely putting our org in a different direction. But sometimes the bets and the risks are worth taking, because that has ultimately landed us in a much better direction, and trying to do it not too late, basically, as well. So not forgetting, Netflix, famously, they started with DVDs. But I also pulled up some other interesting examples here, because this one's pretty obvious, and I think a lot of people know about this one. But some lesser-known pivots that I just want to pull out of here is YouTube started off as a dating site. Don't know if many people knew that. Shopify was a snowboarding company, and Nokia was a paper mill. So these companies started in very different places, and yeah, they ultimately pivoted and became very, very successful. Okay, so one of the first things I would say in your first 30 days, so like it's all great to like go away, do your strategy, talk to people, absorb information, it's all good. But you can also fall into the trap of being like highly visible on your way in, like when you're being introduced to everyone, to then going away and being like, where did that person go? Like, I thought they were here to like lead the technology org and I haven't heard from them again. So one of the things that I think has served me well in my career is looking at the important and urgent quadrant up here. Also, this Eisenhower matrix, amazing. I use it all the time. But I look in this quadrant here and say, is there something like a high amount of toil that we're doing right now? It's something that's increasing the risk too much? Is there an architectural decision that people kind of have a gut feeling about, but kind of just need the confidence and the push to do it, that we can act on right now? And I've got 2 examples that I want to share. So when I was first joined Sneak, I joined there to basically get their infrastructure and operations group up and running. And they were already about 3 years in, so that was interesting. They already had 100 engineers and a lot of customers, and a lot of tech as well. But the thing I noticed was I came in and I had 2 engineers, and they were running an in-house Prometheus stack. That thing fell over like every day. And I was like, what are we doing? This is not our USP, and we shouldn't be doing this. And like, it was almost like 1 engineer of the 2 engineers I had, that was all their time, was fixing it. And I was like, stop. No, we just need to pay somebody to do that for us. Yeah, it's not free, I get it. But it was a lot, it freed up a lot of their time, basically. And you have to kind of constantly think about, like, usually there's some amount of hole that you have to dig yourself out of. Unless you're a brand new startup, there's usually something, a class of technical debt that you need to overcome. And the second one is when I joined my current company. When we went through who is our customer, we had this assumption going in that it's going to be large enterprise energy companies. Turns out that was wrong from doing the market validation. That's some amount of our customer base, but actually, most of our customer base is smaller disruptors. That could be like heat pump installers, solar installers, or EV companies as well. And it was, but the architecture was initially single tenant. And I was like, this is not going to work. This isn't going to scale. This is going to become really costly. But they kind of had this gut instinct. But nobody had given them that kind of confidence or that push. And I was like, hell yeah, we should be moving to multi-tenant, like right now. We can still offer the other option, but like that's going to cost us a lot of money. Like if we have 30, 40 customers and we're running this many tenants, operationally that's really hard. But also, like I said, it becomes very expensive, especially when you have a high throughput, high streaming platform such as ours, where you need to connect to multiple devices and have the device information being very up to date. And this is, just a slide that I pulled out from an article about like, how, this is all great when you're talking to your tech org, but how do you relate this back to your exec team? Because ultimately that's what you're there for, right? And one of the things that I found that landed well was to try and take it out of the tech kind of jargon, but also say like, when we have incidents, how much do they cost? How much do they truly cost us? And this is like a nice way of visualizing that, because money means something to other execs. Same thing with things like reputational damage. So I'm going to whiz through some of this really quick. I'm going to whiz through this really quick. There's this great article by Kellen Elliott McRae. He was a CTO at Etsy. And I've read, it's linked here on the bottom. I've read this article, I swear, at least 20 times. But he talks about the conflation of technical debt and like ways to break that down into actual classes of technical debt and how to reason about that and make good decisions on that. He said one of the lines in the article is around we tend to conflate these things and then we make poor decisions about how to change the code, or we decide we're going to do a complete bottom-up rewrite, when actually that's not the right way to approach it. And yeah, I could think my last point on this section around like your first 30 days is like go and see. It's the Ginchi Kombucha kind of lean Toyota manifesto. It's like, have you set up your computer to ship a change to production? You should probably do that in your first couple of weeks. Yeah, you might be a CTO, doesn't matter. You need to go and see how it works in practice. Have you had lots of one-to-ones with people at different levels and in different parts of the organization? What are their problems? What do they see as opportunities as well? Architecture deep dives. If they don't have the content, I tend to come in and demand it and say, OK, that's fine if you don't have deep dive material ready, but I want you to prepare this, because we are going to go through this. And I think it's very important for a technical leader to get to grips with this very early. And yeah, like I said before, just ADRs, retros, incident analysis reports, production monitoring dashboards, anything you can get your hands on to gain the context. OK, so now we're talking about rallying and mobilizing. So this is like the next phase. So it is a bit like this. You have lots of Legos, but like, what are you building? You could end up with lots of different results at the end of it. And this is where I think, again, repeating the strategy and the vision is really important. And one of the best ways I've found about doing this as well is not only just getting up in front of people and just repeating it, but again, like playing it back to smaller audiences, going and asking for feedback, even doing that on a one-to-one basis. Do people actually understand where we're going? And making sure that it becomes understandable by all. And then there's this to think about as well. This is like a really nice, based on a white paper around the theory of influence. It might have been covered in a previous talk, but this is something we have to really think about too. Like, when you go in, it's best to find out who are your influencers. Who's on your side? Who's your zealots? They're the best people to kind of grasp onto, because they say a large swathe of the audience tends to be passive or waverers. They're not sure about you. And then you have the outright kind of mutineer types as well, or opponents, that you have to convince that what you're doing is the right thing. On this one, I thought there was a funny quote on this one as well, around, somebody said like, oh, it's more advantageous to bring somebody for a beer. You're 31% more likely to influence them than to put pressure on them, which is only a 3% return. That was quite funny. Like, yeah, it's like almost like, incentivizing people, maybe buttering them up with drinks is a better tactic than even putting pressure, which stands to be at nearly the bottom. First team, I think this has been covered. So 5 dysfunctions of a team, what you can do to overcome those as well. But one thing I wanted to point out here as well is that your first team is usually your exec team, but I think it's about coaching that into everybody. Like I tell this to my staff engineers, my managers, my directors, like your first team tends to be at a leadership level who your peers are, who are you beside. That could be even in different functional areas as well. And this is a concept also that Jason Wong, there's an article that he's written on the internet called The First Team Mindset. Go and look it up. I didn't link to it, unfortunately. But there's a great thread on that. The other thing I'd say as well is like what puts you in a really strong position is, as leaders, events like this is where it matters. Like, we need to make this network. Because there's frankly a lot of weird shit that we come up against that people in our organization can't help us answer, but somebody out in this audience probably has faced at some point. So I think like making sure that you have an outside network is just as important, if not more important. But also there's only so much that you can share, usually internally as well. I do think leadership can be somewhat lonely in that way, because you can't obviously go and vent to people, or maybe you are facing a challenge that you just don't know how to solve, but your other leaders or people in different functional areas are not going to be able to help. Gosh, I'm really quickly running out of time. So team topologies has probably been brought up. So like you need to think about how are you designing your org, and again, follow this model. Architecture models as well. Like when you're trying to get up early, get yourself going early, it's like architecture models help a lot. So something we did at Sneak when we first thought about how we're going to design our systems and create different deployment options, is what we called them, was thinking about this layers approach, which then turned into this very robust reference architecture. So this is one pane of about 30, where we thought, okay, what's the current state of our architecture, but what's the future state going to look like in a year and then in 2 years' time? And again, like it feels like a lot of investment, but again, it helps you kind of move along your North Star to where you need to be. And practices as well. I come from early days, so XP, is a key thing, but I think like you need to set down your practices and your principles early as well and make sure that those are codified in the ways that you work, but also the principles in the way that you even do things in code and out of the box. And I'd be remiss not to mention in this section cultural norms. I'm not going to talk about culture too much, but this is a great thing from GDS. It's a famous "It's okay to" poster, which I think probably a lot of you have seen. But people need to feel safe where they are. And they need to know what they can do and what they can't do, and putting some guardrails around that. Oh gosh, I'm out of time. So executing and scaling, I'm going to talk about this really, really quick. So one of the things I like to do when I go into an organization as well is like, what types of work are we actually doing? So there tends to be other types of work happening. It's not just building and running. There's other things that teams might be doing, like consultancy, advocacy, training, documentation. But also when you start to quantify this and measure it, you might think, well, hold on a second. 20% of operations time, we need to bring that down. That's too much. You can start to look for places where you need to optimize in your organization. And then, oh, that doesn't look right. What's going on there? I exported this as a PowerPoint, so my Arial font has turned into, frankly, gibberish. I don't know why on the slide. So guilds are another powerful mechanism that you can pull when you don't want just static teams. So you can do this however you want. You might have things which are based around technical languages, but I tend to like those less, and have things like around testing, performance, incident response and analysis. I've actually even done a hiring guild, which helped do things like overcome bias and kind of hire a very diverse kind of range of engineers. So talk to me about that afterwards if you're interested, but that actually tended to be probably the most successful guild that I ever created, was my hiring and onboarding guild. And second up to that was the incident response and analysis guild. So making decisions. So we need to make some decisions. So I think one thing that can be overlooked is like, where is your product and tech product and data roadmap? Because these things need to be unified with the tech roadmap as well. A lot of times we need the product one first, because that speaks more to the business. But I do think that tech and data kind of somewhat follow that as well. So it's about partnering with your other execs. So one of the things, when I come back to technical debt, one of the things that I see repeated a lot is like people not being, like particularly engineers, not being able to quantify or talk about in business terms why I'd make this investment over this investment. And often we are in constant tension with product. Product want to ship things, they want to build things. And for a tech to kind of get its place and get the capacity that it needs, I think it needs to be reframed. And there's some good articles out there on the internet about like really lightweight frameworks that you can use on how to pull together a business case. Like, what are the 3 options you looked at? What are the constraints? What's the return? What's your recommendation? And trying to coach that into staff. And that's something I've tried to repeat in every single organization that I've worked for, because you kind of want them to be business leaders as well and to think in business terms. The 1- and 6-pager process from Amazon is really good. I've used that actively through the last 3 organizations. This talks about how do you make decisions and how do you bring people together into a meeting to read and then comment on something and then pull forward with a decision. And then when you're ready, you actually document the decision so that it's there for posterity and architectural decision records. And like I said before, keeping your ownership up to date, whether that be through a service catalog or whatever you use, just this is very, very important. It causes a lot of, like I said, angst and waste. And then last but not least, like your staff and your management, they also need to think about what they're going to do org-wide. So I think sitting down on the Eisenhower matrix that I showed earlier, pulling them into some workshops and saying, okay, what could we do that's more cross-functional and more meaningful, because we are leaders and we have other work that we do that isn't just managing our teams. And just being super clear about what you're not doing. This is one of the traps that I fell into, I think, until I was at Sneak, and then we had very explicit, like, this is what we're not doing, as well as what we're doing. I think if you don't do this, it can become really easy to do 50 things rather than 3 things at once. I'm going to skip past this one. So build versus buy. I think this has already been talked about. One of the things I'd say that, again, is a trap that I've seen people fall into, I won't talk about all of this, is sunk cost fallacy. So I've seen teams where they've invested in something so long, but then that thing becomes commoditized to a point where they just don't want to step away from it. But I think you as a leader, you're able to take that kind of downward view and say, well, look, I know that we invested in that then. That technology didn't exist, or that architectural pattern didn't exist, but it does now. So the lever to pull is actually to move away from this, use that commodity, and use our time somewhere else. And then, yeah, just how do people think? So there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. So how do people think? They think in two modes. One is kind of an execution mode, and one is more of a thinking mode, which is more thoughtful, allowed for kind of experimentation. And so what did we do? So we ended up, at my current company, changing the way that we do cycles and making time for things like research. So we have 3 sprints. Then we go for a break week where we spend that time on research or learning. And then we do it again and repeat. And this works really well for us. And we do things like baking in 10% time as well. And the other thing I'd say is like when somebody's on call, they're out of the sprint rotation. They don't have to do sprint work. They're looking at operability kind of improvements, leveling up on automation. They're doing upgrades, tooling gaps, and process improvements as well to try and make sure that you're constantly on top of the types of work that your technical org needs to manage. And again, like I said before, working backwards. Very, very last, you're like, come on, hurry. Very last section. So read this book. It's amazing. I love this quote. If you know almost nothing, almost anything will tell you something. And this talks about like things that feel fluffy and intangible, how to put scientific and statistical rigor against that in a way that you can measure it. And just a few quick things that we've done at Sneak. We actually did come up with this cost of delay model that told us, okay, if the CI pipeline takes an hour to build each build, how much money are we actually wasting in people's salaries and time, and how much does it cost us to run as well, like on the actual like Circle CI and that kind of thing. And then we brought the same model over to incidents as well. This is something that a lot of people say we can't quantify that. I would say you can, but also think about other factors such as business reputational damage to things like incidents as well. It's not just purely about the money. And just learning and adapting. So John Osbaugh from the resilience engineering kind of place talks about this a lot, like how can we constantly keep our mental models aligned? It's really hard because our systems, our platforms, they're changing all the time. And it's about like how can you keep people on top of that? And I think incidents, if you can, are a great way to learn, basically. Okay, I'm going to skip past I just want to share my very last piece here. So OKRs, yeah, sure. They serve you sometimes, they sometimes don't. But I want to talk about this real quick. So one of the things I'd say that is key for me as well is there's a lot of theory out there, but I'd love doing things more in practice. The theory is great, but one of the things that I've found as well is like actually doing things in practice. And a lot of times you'll debunk what the research tells you or what the theory tells you. And I think a lot of people will just dogmatically just adopt things. And I know that Laura already did a talk on this, but this is something I wanted to show is like things that we learned when we actually tried to put things like DORA metrics in practice. One of my biggest learnings here was like PR cycle time can be all over the place. But when I started to actually go around and interview people, they said the biggest point of waste was actually the JIRA ping pong. Things not being clear at the start, requirements being misconstrued, product and engineering having this ping pong effect. And they said it was like almost out of band was where a lot of the time was actually being spent and wasted. And it was things that we couldn't even quantify through here because it's out of band. But it was interesting to kind of do both the qualitative and the quantitative research to do this. Yeah, let's run through these. And then we had a monolithic architecture, and we did this thing called a reliability index. So yeah, the monolith, as we knew, was really bad, but being able to put it on a graph and to show the leadership team was like, yeah, no, we actually do need to make investment in this because it's breaking like 80% of the time when we build it. And then we used Backstage, Service Catalog, and it does lots of cool stuff as well. But again, adopt it when it's right at the time. So so I've run through a lot of stuff really fast. This is my last slide, my next penultimate slide, I should say. you've laid down a lot of great things. Hopefully you've coached your staff really well and kind of made them all leaders in their own right. But you need to think about like, okay, it's time to move on. What do I need to do here? I think one of the things you have to think about is like who have you got in your organization that will be your successor, and trying to identify those people early, but also setting them up for success. Because I think legacy, like it says here, is not what I did for myself, but it's what I'm doing for the next generation. And it's about being able to say, okay, I brought all of these things in, laid all of this down, but also before you leave saying, okay, this is amazing, but again, like casting your mind forward, what does the next 2 years look like for us? And how are we going to get there? But hopefully leaving things better than where you found it. But anyway, that's me. There's so much more that I could share. There's like 100 other things that I wanted to put in this presentation, but I just don't have time. But I'm way out of time. Come and find me, chat to me about anything, argue with me about anything. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.